Texas, summer of 1944. The air shimmered above the cotton fields, dry and heavy under a pale noon sun. A military truck rumbled down a dusty farm road, its wooden sides lined with men in faded Wehrmacht uniforms. Their faces were sunburned and silent, prisoners of a war that now felt oceans away. When the truck stopped, the Germans climbed down under the watchful eyes of 2 U.S. guards. The field stretched endlessly, rows of white cotton glowing like snow beneath the Texas sky. But what caught their attention wasn't a rifle in the guard hands. It was a woman approaching from a farmhouse porch. She carried a basket of cornbread, waved gently, and said something they didn't understand. Then she smiled. The Germans looked at one another, bewildered. Was this kindness? Was it a trick? One laughed, half disbelief, half fear. They had been told Americans were monsters. Yet here they stood, being offered bread instead of bullets. That afternoon would become one of countless quiet moments that changed how enemies saw each other. Forever. By 1943, the war that had once seemed unstoppable for Germany was collapsing in on itself. Across North Africa, tens of thousands of Axis troops surrendered to the Allies in a series of devastating defeats. From Tunisia to El Alamein, the Wehrmacht, which had marched triumphantly across Europe just 3 years earlier, now found itself fractured, starving, and surrounded. In May 1943 alone, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms in Tunisia. The Allied command was faced with an unprecedented problem: where to house this growing tide of prisoners. Britain was already full, struggling under the weight of bombings and food shortages. The answer came from across the Atlantic, a land vast, secure, and rich in resources: the United States. The U.S. Army began a massive operation to transport captured Axis soldiers across the ocean. Between 1943 and 1946, more than 425,000 German POWs will be held on American soil. For many of them, the journey was surreal. They had fought believing America was a decadent, violent enemy. Yet they were now crossing the sea not in chains, but on ships treated according to the Geneva Convention. Food, medical care, even cigarettes were provided. Among the 48 states, Texas became the heart of this vast prison network. Its climate resembled parts of southern Europe. Its rural spaces were abundant, and its farms were desperate for hands. With over 70,000 Texas men serving overseas, the state's agricultural economy was collapsing. The federal government saw an opportunity, employed German POWs as temporary laborers to keep the harvest alive. By late 1943, the first camps began to appear, large barbed wire enclosures built near military bases like Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Mahia, and Camp Huntsville. These installations soon expanded into more than 70 branch camps scattered across the state. Inside, life followed a strict rhythm. Roll call at dawn, inspections, work assignments, mail delivery, evening roll call, lights out. The Germans slept in wooden barracks, ate American rations, and received pay, script money redeemable at camp canteens. Yet what astonished many was the absence of brutality. Compared to the Eastern Front or the conditions they had imagined under the enemy, Texas felt almost unreal. The guards, mostly young Americans themselves, rarely acted with hatred. Some were farmers or ranch hands before the war, ordinary men thrust into uniform. To them, the prisoners were not monsters but workers, and eventually fellow humans trying to endure a global catastrophe. Still, suspicion ran deep. Locals in nearby towns whispered about Hitler's men living just beyond the fences. Children dared each other to sneak peeks through the wire. Newspapers published warnings not to fraternize, while preachers reminded congregations that compassion must never become disloyalty. And yet, human nature is hard to restrain. The Germans sang in the evenings, playing makeshift violins and harmonicas. Their songs carried across the fields, strange and melancholy. Farmers heard them while fixing fences or walking home at dusk. They sounded less like enemies and more like young men far from home. The War Department soon permitted supervised labor outside camp boundaries. POWs were trucked to cotton fields, sawmills, and sugar beet farms, often under light guard. Payment went to the U.S. government, but the work brought the men a sense of dignity and routine. For local farmers, it was salvation. Crops could be saved, herds managed, and families supported while husbands and sons fought abroad. This daily proximity, enemy and civilian, side by side under the same relentless sun, began to erode barriers that no propaganda could sustain. Farmers discovered that many Germans were polite, disciplined, even grateful. The prisoners, in turn, found that their supposed enemy treated them with fairness and decency. It started small, a shared cigarette during a break, a cup of cold water passed through the fence, a cautious word of thanks exchanged through halting English and German. But in these quiet gestures, something began to shift. The war's fury felt distant out here. The headlines from Normandy, the Pacific, and the ruins of Europe reached Texas only through radios and newspapers. In the cotton fields, war reduced itself to something smaller and more personal. Men simply trying to understand one another. And it was in those fields that the first smiles appeared, tentative, uncertain, but real. The soldiers who had once shouted, "Heil Hitler," now nodded politely to Texas farmers and said, "Danke." The fences remained, but they were no longer the same. Something human was breaking through the wire. Daily life inside a Texas POW camp followed a discipline that felt oddly familiar to many of the captured Germans. They woke before sunrise, to bugles echoing across the flat horizon. Not so different from the reveilles they once heard in North Africa or Sicily. Roll call came next, followed by breakfast. Powdered eggs, coffee, bread, sometimes canned fruit. The menu, by Geneva Convention standards, mirrored that of the American troops guarding them. This rule, though bureaucratic on paper, became a quiet act of humanity in practice. It reminded both sides that even in war, there were limits, a shared code of decency that separated soldiers from savages. For the prisoners, this treatment was shocking. Many expected humiliation or starvation. Instead, they found organized camps, medical care, libraries, even classrooms. Under supervision, they were allowed to read, attend lectures, and form orchestras or theater groups. In Camp Hearn, some staged full plays in makeshift auditoriums. Others painted or crafted miniature furniture, trading their work for tobacco or stationery. American officers, trained to uphold international law, enforced discipline but not cruelty. Punishments were rare. Infractions usually meant loss of privileges or confinement to barracks. The guards themselves were often astonished by the prisoners' behavior. The salutes, the orderly routines, the sheer cleanliness of the camp streets. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Among the POWs were die-hard Nazis, still loyal to the Reich. They intimidated others, spread propaganda, and punished those who seemed too friendly toward Americans. Camp authorities learned quickly that ideological divisions ran deep. Separate compounds were established to isolate hardliners from those ready to move on from the war. Outside the fences, Texas life continued at its slow, steady rhythm. But the war's demands were felt everywhere. The fields were short of hands, the canneries and mills understaffed. The War Manpower Commission approved the use of POW labor, a decision that would transform both the state's economy and its social landscape. Under armed escort, trucks carried groups of prisoners to local farms at dawn. They worked long hours under blistering Texas sun, picking cotton, cutting timber, repairing fences. Guards watched from shade or horseback, rifles slung casually, more as a formality than threat. The first encounters with civilians were awkward, uncertain, tinged with mutual fear. Farmers were instructed not to talk to the prisoners. But silence never lasts long among people who must share the same ground day after day. When language failed, gestures took over. A farmer's wife would leave a jug of cold water by the gate. A German, sweating through his khaki work shirt, would nod in thanks. Over time, these moments grew. A shared meal during lunch breaks, the loan of a tool, a quiet laugh at some small mistake in translation. For many Texans, curiosity replaced caution. They realized these weren't the fanatical stormtroopers the newspapers described. They were young men, some barely out of school, who missed home, music, and mothers. Some wore small crosses around their necks. Others carried worn photographs of wives and children tucked inside their shirt pockets. The war that divided them suddenly seemed a very long way off. Inside the camps, word spread quickly of the strange kindness of these Texans. Prisoners wrote letters home, describing the people they met and the food they tasted: sweet corn, coffee, and biscuits. They wrote of the strange feeling of being treated not as animals, but as men. The U.S. government carefully monitored such correspondence. Propaganda value was enormous. Humane treatment of German prisoners became a moral weapon against the Reich. But for those living the experience, it was more than politics. It was survival with dignity. Soon, farmers began requesting their same crews again, preferring familiar faces who worked hard and caused no trouble. The men learned bits of English. "Thank you. Good morning, ma'am," while children in nearby towns picked up German words from them in turn. At dusk, when the trucks rolled back through the gates, the Germans would wave at the families watching from porches. And sometimes, quietly, those waves were returned. It was in these simple exchanges that the extraordinary began to grow: trust, sympathy, and something even deeper. The line between enemy and neighbor was softening. And soon, one act of kindness would turn that fragile thread into something unforgettable, an invitation no one expected, not even the prisoners themselves. One, the human angle. For the captured Germans, Texas was not just a place. It was a shock to the soul. They had expected punishment. They found sunlight, order, and decency instead. After years of living under a regime that worshipped strength and despised mercy, many could not comprehend the world they'd fallen into. Letters and diaries from former POWs reveal a pattern of disbelief. One soldier from North Africa wrote, "The guards treat us like men. They call us by name. They joke with us. This is not the America Goebbels warned us about." Inside the camps, conversations at night often turned philosophical. What did it mean to be the enemy if the enemy behaved more humanely than their own commanders? The realization came slowly, painfully, that their lives had been shaped by lies, and that honor might exist even among those they had fought to destroy. For the older veterans, this humanity felt almost suspicious. For the younger ones, many still in their teens, it planted seeds that would grow for the rest of their lives. They would carry home a story that contradicted everything they were taught, that compassion had power even in wartime. These human awakenings unfolded quietly, without speeches or ceremonies, just the everyday miracle of survival, decency, and work. A shared cigarette under a mesquite tree. A farmer's daughter smiling shyly at men who had once worn the Iron Cross. Behind barbed wire, the war was reduced to faces and gestures. No flags, no slogans, just men rediscovering their humanity one day at a time. 2, the American angle. For Texans, too, the experience was transformative. The war had taken their sons, brothers, and husbands. Towns were drained of manpower. Many women ran farms alone, their hands blistered from the work that once required a dozen men. When the War Department proposed using German POWs for labor, emotions were divided. At first, outrage. How could the government reward the enemy with steady meals while American boys starved in Europe? Newspapers printed furious letters. Some families swore they'd never allow Nazis on their land. But war wears down even the hardest convictions. The cotton needed picking. The orchards needed tending. And when the first trucks arrived, curiosity slowly overcame anger. Farmers who expected arrogance found politeness. "Yes, sir," "No, ma'am," spoken with thick accents but genuine respect. The prisoners worked diligently, following orders, asking little in return. One farmer from Caldwell County later recalled, "They worked harder than any hired hand I ever had. We stopped seeing them as soldiers. They were just boys." Children were the first to cross the invisible line. They waved from fences, mimicking German words they'd overheard. Mothers scolded them, then, weeks later, offered cold lemonade to the guards and prisoners alike. This was the quiet American side of the story, a test not of military might, but of moral conviction. The people of Texas had been raised with faith, community, and a belief in fair treatment. That belief did not stop at the edge of war. Some guards, young men barely older than the POWs, began to question the nature of enemy. They shared cigarettes, traded photographs, swapped jokes about the heat. The same sun burned them all. The same sweat stung their eyes. In that shared labor, the abstract notion of war shrank to something smaller, the daily decency between men. Texans learned that these Germans were not symbols of tyranny, but individuals caught in its machinery. And for many, that understanding would stay with them long after the last prisoner had gone home. 3. The cultural angle. If the human and American angles revealed the heart, the cultural one revealed the soul. Every encounter between Texan and German was a study in contrasts. Language, food, manners, music, and faith colliding under a merciless southern sky. Meals became a bridge. At first, the Germans refused certain foods, cornbread, black-eyed peas, or chili they found too spicy. But hunger and curiosity conquered hesitation. In time, they developed a taste for American staples. Farmers' wives discovered that even prisoners appreciated good cooking, and soon, quiet gestures became routine. A loaf of bread left by a gate. A pie shared with the work crew. Music followed. On Sundays, the Germans sang hymns during chapel services. Nearby families heard the voices drifting through the barbed wire, harmonies so haunting that locals would stop outside the fences just to listen. Later, some brought guitars and joined in. Gospel met German folk song in the fields of Texas, a sound no one expected to hear in wartime. Even faith became a meeting ground. Local pastors were invited to hold services for the POWs. Some prisoners, once steeped in Nazi ideology, rediscovered religion under those wooden camp chapels. One minister in Brenham later recalled baptizing both Texans and German soldiers in the same creek. Cultural boundaries softened through shared humanity. The Germans marveled at how openly Americans spoke, to superiors, to strangers, to God. Texans, in turn, admired the discipline and skill of their unexpected guests. The two worlds were vastly different, yet side by side they found surprising harmony. By the end of 1944, reports circulated of farmers inviting the German boys to sing at Christmas gatherings, or accepting small wooden toys carved by POWs as gifts. These gestures were not grand political statements. They were simple, quiet acknowledgments that war could not erase kindness. For the prisoners, it was confusing, even disorienting. How could a people at war show such grace? How could the enemy be this human? They began to laugh at the absurdity of it all, not mockingly, but with disbelief. And it was that laughter, half joy, half surrender, that marked the turning point soon to come. For the moral and ideological angle behind the barbed wire of Texas, another invisible war unfolded, not between nations, but between ideas. Many of these German prisoners had been raised in a world where loyalty to the Reich was absolute. They had been taught that mercy was weakness, that democracy was chaos, and that America was a land of greed and decay. Yet here, every day, that doctrine unraveled. The moral shock was profound. POW saw black and white Americans working side by side, a confusing sight for men indoctrinated by Nazi racial ideology. They saw women driving tractors, running farms, and speaking freely. They saw guards who obeyed rules not out of fear, but out of duty. One German officer later admitted in an interview, "We could not understand it. The Americans were strict but fair. They treated us better than we treated our own prisoners." Inside the camps, secret debates erupted. Some die-hard Nazis called the Americans weak, insisting that their kindness was deception. Others quietly disagreed. The evidence was too plain. The longer they stayed, the harder it became to reconcile propaganda with reality. It was a slow moral awakening, not taught by sermons, but by behavior. For many POWs, the simple act of being treated decently forced them to confront everything they'd been told about good and evil. And when the first invitations from Texans came, an offer of food, a seat at a family table, it wasn't just hospitality. It was moral defiance against the logic of war itself. 5. The administrative and military angle. The American system that allowed these POWs to live and work in relative freedom was not built on sentiment. It was built on meticulous law. The U.S. War Department's Prisoner of War Division, established in 1942, followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. The idea was simple. Treat enemy prisoners well, and it might encourage reciprocal treatment for American captives in Europe and the Pacific. Each camp operated like a small town. Commanding officers oversaw security, welfare, and work details. The Red Cross conducted regular inspections, ensuring compliance with international law. Prisoners were paid modest wages, had access to mail, and could even receive books or musical instruments through neutral intermediaries. But the Texas camps posed unique challenges. They were too large, too scattered, and too intertwined with civilian life. Local farmers needed help, and the Army needed cooperation. The line between military necessity and human contact blurred quickly. At first, the War Department discouraged fraternization. Guards were instructed to remain professional. Civilians warned against fraternizing with the enemy. But policy often bends to reality. Texas farmers relied on those German hands. And as reports came in describing the prisoners' discipline and respect, military administrators quietly relaxed their stance. By late 1944, field commanders noted that relations between civilians and POWs were remarkably good. A few even suggested that such goodwill could serve as a quiet weapon of democracy. The system worked, but it was also fragile. A single act of violence, a single escape attempt, could shatter the balance. And yet, astonishingly, Texas saw almost none. The POWs understood they were safer here than anywhere else on Earth. For the Americans, the war's brutality felt distant. Together, they preserved an uneasy peace, one maintained as much by mutual trust as by military rule. That trust would soon be tested in the most unexpected of ways. Over a shared meal. 6. The psychological angle. For both sides, war's greatest wounds were not physical. They were psychological. The Germans lived behind fences, haunted by guilt, loss, and uncertainty. The Americans lived outside those fences, haunted by fear, absence, and constant news from the front. And in between them lay the human need for connection. Prison psychologists later described the Texas camps as laboratories of reorientation. Every small act of kindness became a test of what men truly believed about themselves and their enemies. The Germans, stripped of ideology, began rediscovering individuality. The Americans, stripped of hatred, rediscovered empathy. The results were profound. Some prisoners fell into deep depression, their pride shattered, their country collapsing. Others found a strange kind of peace in the monotony of camp life. They gardened, played soccer, built small chapels, and found purpose in work. For the guards, too, the experience was quietly transformative. Many were farm boys who had never left Texas before the war. Now they stood guard over men who had marched through Paris, fought at Tobruk, or served under Rommel. Yet the prisoners looked more tired than terrifying. In shared glances and casual talk, both sides recognized something universal: exhaustion. It was during one of these long, hot work days that the boundaries began to dissolve entirely. A local farmer, having watched the same group of German laborers toil in his fields for weeks, decided to do something unthinkable. On a quiet Sunday, he told the guard they could come to his house for dinner. Just a simple meal, no uniforms, no weapons, no politics. The guard hesitated. The prisoners stared in disbelief. It sounded like a joke, but it wasn't. That invitation, simple, impulsive, and profoundly human, would become one of the most remarkable acts of compassion on American soil during the Second World War. And when the prisoners laughed, it wasn't mockery. It was disbelief, a kind of stunned joy at discovering that even in war, grace still existed. Texas, late summer of 1944. The sun hung low over the fields outside Hearne. The air shimmered with heat and the hum of cicadas. A War Department truck bounced down a dirt road. Its canvas flaps rolled up. Inside, a dozen German prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder, their khaki work shirts stained with sweat and dust. They had spent the day chopping weeds and hauling sacks of cotton. When the truck stopped by the main road, they expected the routine roll call inspection, then back to camp for supper. But the guard at the rear, a young corporal named Jack Wilkins, wasn't giving orders. He was smiling awkwardly, as though unsure of what to say. "Boys," he finally muttered, "Mr. Henderson's invited y'all to supper. Says his missus cooked too much." The Germans blinked. One of them laughed out loud, thinking it was a joke. Supper? At the farmer's house? With Americans? But then the truck turned, not toward the camp, but toward the farmhouse. They climbed down hesitantly, boots crunching against gravel. The setting sun painted the porch in gold. The farmer, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, stood waiting beside his wife. She wiped her hands on her apron, nervous but resolute. "Evening," she said softly. The words were simple, but the moment wasn't. The prisoners stood in silence. Some kept their eyes down. Others looked around, half expecting a trap. Then, slowly, they were ushered inside. The smell of roast chicken and bread filled the air. The table was long, mismatched chairs pulled close, plates already set, glasses of sweet tea sweating in the heat. The farmer gestured for them to sit. No one spoke for a while. The clatter of utensils was the only sound. One of the younger Germans, no older than 20, stared at a bowl of mashed potatoes as if it were something sacred. Another crossed himself before eating, a habit he'd hidden for years under Nazi rule. The farmer's wife broke the silence. "You boys got folks back home?" she asked gently. A few nodded. One reached into his pocket, pulled out a creased photograph, a woman and 2 small children standing before a modest house in Hamburg. The room grew quiet again. Then came the moment no one forgot. The farmer raised his glass and said, "To peace, whenever finds us." The Germans exchanged glances, unsure whether to respond. Finally, one of them, a former schoolteacher from Bremen, whispered in halting English, "To peace and to kindness." They drank together, and in that instant, the war, with all its banners, orders, and hatred, seemed impossibly far away. After the meal, conversation began to flow, awkward but sincere. The farmer asked about farming in Germany. The men described wheat fields along the Elbe. The farmer's wife asked about winters there. Cold, one said, shivering theatrically. Everyone laughed. For a few hours, the walls of suspicion fell completely. The guards relaxed on the porch, smoking. The farmer's children peeked from behind a doorway, giggling at the strange language. One of the Germans, a former violinist, spotted a guitar hanging on the wall. He asked permission with a gesture. The farmer nodded. The notes that followed were hesitant, fragile, but soon became a tune everyone recognized, Silent Night. It wasn't Christmas, but somehow it felt right. The voices joined, German and English mingling under the Texas sky. Neighbors working nearby paused to listen. A song written in Austria more than a century earlier now floated across American farmland, uniting enemies in the middle of the greatest war the world had ever seen. When the song ended, no one spoke. The silence was full, not empty. One of the guards looked down, embarrassed by the lump in his throat. Before they left, the farmer's wife wrapped leftover bread in a towel and handed it to the men. "For later," she said simply. The Germans accepted it as if receiving communion. On the drive back, no one laughed. No one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the truck engine and the steady rhythm of wheels on dirt. Inside each prisoner's mind, the same thought turned quietly. What kind of people are these? By the time the gates of the camp appeared in the distance, something irreversible had changed. They were still prisoners, but they no longer saw their captors as enemies. And perhaps more remarkably, the Texans no longer saw the Germans as monsters. That dinner, unrecorded in official reports, but remembered in letters, journals, and memory, would echo far beyond that dusty Texas evening. It was proof that in a world drowning in hate, one act of decency could still create light. Word of the dinner spread faster than the Texas wind. By the next morning, men inside Camp Hearn were talking. Some of the guards found it amusing. Old Man Henderson fed the Crouch roast chicken. One laughed over coffee, but others weren't laughing. To a few officers, it was improper, even dangerous. "Rules exist for a reason," one captain said. His voice clipped. "You start treating prisoners like neighbors, and soon they'll forget who won the war." But the War Department quietly looked the other way. The truth was, by 1944, most American officials already knew the German POWs in the United States were unlike the enemy described in propaganda. These weren't frontline fanatics or hardened Nazis. Many were young draftees, teachers, and farmers who had simply followed orders and found themselves across an ocean, far from home. Inside the camp, the atmosphere began to shift. The guards noticed it first. The tension that once hung between them and the prisoners had softened. The daily roll calls were quieter. Jokes, timid, careful, started crossing the language barrier. One evening, a sergeant found a German prisoner repairing a broken fence post outside the barracks, though no one had ordered him to. "If the fence is good," the prisoner said in slow English, "the cat'll stay in. That's good for everyone." The sergeant didn't know how to reply. He simply nodded. The Texas townspeople noticed, too. Farmers who had once refused POW labor began asking for it. "They work hard, don't complain," one woman told a reporter from the Dallas Morning News. "And they don't look much different from our boys overseas." Letters began arriving from Germany, not directly, but through the Red Cross. Families wrote of bombed cities' hunger and uncertainty. The prisoners shared those letters with camp interpreters, who passed them to guards. It became impossible to see these men as faceless enemies. Still, not everyone approved. In some communities, suspicion lingered. "My boy's fighting in France," one mother said sharply. "Why should those Germans get pie and tea?" Her words carried the weight of grief, and they were fair words. Every American family had someone across the sea. Every dinner given to a German was, to some, an affront to that sacrifice. Yet even among the skeptics, curiosity grew. After the war, historians would find diaries from Texas families describing their experiences. One wrote, "At first I was angry. Then I saw them, boys with sunburns and calloused hands. One thanked me for water in perfect English. I felt ashamed of my anger." Inside Camp Hearn, some of the Germans began teaching English classes to each other. A few started translating American books. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer circulated quietly, its pages worn by callous fingers. They also began to write letters to families, yes, but also reflection sketches and poems. Many described the landscape, the wide skies, the endless cotton, the smell of rain on dust. Texas had changed them. The turning point reached its quiet peak during a Sunday service in late 1944. The camp's chaplain, an American Methodist minister, invited a few prisoners to join the small outdoor gathering. Some guards frowned, but the prisoners came, standing respectfully behind the Americans as the pastor read from the book of Matthew. "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you." When the service ended, one of the prisoners, a former theology student named Otto, approached the chaplain. "This verse," he said in careful English, "we forgot it in Germany." The chaplain nodded. "Many forgot it everywhere," he replied. That short exchange would later appear in the chaplain's own memoir, Under the Texas Sun, Behind Barbed Wire. He wrote, "It was then I realized the war would end not with surrender, but with understanding." In the month that followed, the camp became almost self-sufficient. The Germans built furniture, grew vegetables, even staged plays and concerts. American families sometimes attended, sitting outside the fences, clapping when the prisoners played Beethoven or sang folk songs. It was still war, but within those fences, a different kind of peace was forming. Fragile, human, defiant. For many of the prisoners, that single dinner in the farmhouse became a symbol, a small act of kindness that broke the machinery of hate. Years later, when they returned to Germany, they wrote about it in memoirs, telling how Texans treated them not as beasts, but as men. One former Luftwaffe mechanic recalled, "I came to America believing it was my enemy. I left knowing it was a country of people with large hearts." The story did not make the front pages. It didn't change strategy or command decisions, but in the quiet ledger of human decency, it marked something far greater, a shift from fear to respect, from hatred to something resembling forgiveness. And that shift, born on a dusty Texas evening, would outlast the war itself, because long before the surrender in Europe, in the hearts of a few German prisoners and a handful of American farmers, peace had already begun. May 1945. The radios crackled across America with the words everyone had waited for. Germany had surrendered. In the towns surrounding the Texas camps, church bells rang and families wept with relief. For them, the war that had consumed the world was finally over. But behind the barbed wire, the mood was far quieter. The German prisoners gathered in small groups, some standing motionless, others staring toward the horizon. They were no longer soldiers, no longer enemies, just men waiting for a future they could barely imagine. Inside Camp Hearn, guards read aloud the official news: Hitler dead, Berlin fallen, Germany occupied. There was no cheering, only silence. A few men bowed their heads. One, a former Wehrmacht sergeant, whispered, "Yes, ist vorbei. It's over." But the end of the war did not mean immediate freedom. The American camps remained full through 1945 as the War Department organized repatriations. Ships were scarce. Paperwork was endless. Thousands of prisoners who had worked Texas soil all year now faced months of uncertainty. In those months, something remarkable continued to unfold. The POWs were allowed more contact with locals. Some attended small church services. Others continued farm work, now shoulder to shoulder with returning American soldiers. A few were even invited back to the same Texas homes where they had once shared Sunday supper. For both sides, these encounters carried a strange tenderness, a sense of unfinished understanding. Mrs. Henderson, the farmer's wife whose invitation had once astonished a truck full of prisoners, wrote later in a letter to her sister, "They're still boys, tired boys who want to go home. I can't hate them anymore. I can only hope someone feeds my son the same way if he's ever taken prisoner." Many Americans who had met the Germans privately confessed to a change of heart. They had discovered what propaganda had hidden, that humanity, stripped of flags and uniforms, looks very much the same on both sides of war. As the months passed, the camp's activities slowed. The prisoners packed their belongings. A few carved trinkets, letters, small drawings of Texas sunsets. Some had written Danke, Texas, on the back of scrap wood, planning to leave it behind. When the first repatriation orders arrived in late 1945, the camp was quiet but heavy with emotion. The trucks came again, the same trucks that had once taken them to cotton fields. But now, as they rolled through the gates, the guards saluted the men they had once guarded. In one eyewitness account, an American MP wrote, "They climbed aboard slow, looking back like men leaving home. I didn't expect that." The journey to Galveston took several hours. From there, ships carried the POWs to England for processing, and eventually back to a shattered Germany. What awaited them was devastation. Cities in ruins, families scattered, hunger widespread. Yet many who returned from Texas carried something rare, a memory of dignity. Some would later write to farmers who had employed them, sending postcards from Bremen or Stuttgart. "We are alive," one wrote in 1946. Texas was the only place in the war where I felt like a man again. And for those Americans who had opened their homes, those memories also lingered. Decades later, at reunions and historical gatherings, they spoke of the time they'd shared a table with the enemy, and how it had quietly reshaped their understanding of victory. Because for them, the true triumph wasn't in defeating Germany. It was in defeating hate itself. And though the camps would soon be dismantled, the fences torn down, the barracks emptied, the lessons born within them would endure far beyond the war's end. The world was learning that reconciliation doesn't begin in treaties or speeches. It begins sometimes with something as small and human as a shared meal. In the years that followed the war, the camps disappeared from the Texas landscape almost as quietly as they had appeared. By 1947, the barbed wire was gone. The barracks were dismantled, the watchtowers torn down. Cotton fields grew again where the fences had once stood. But in the minds of those who had lived through it, guards, farmers, and prisoners alike, the memories refused to fade. For the Germans who returned home, Texas became more than a place. It became a symbol of decency in a world that had forgotten how to be decent. In a nation shattered by defeat, where cities lay in rubble and food was scarce, many former POWs told their family stories of kindness under the American sun. One of them, Friedrich Keller, a former tank mechanic from Bavaria, wrote in a 1952 memoir, "They took my freedom, but not my dignity. In Texas, I learned that an enemy can still be a human being." His words resonated across post-war Germany, where people were struggling to understand how to rebuild both physically and morally. In 1953, when the United States launched the Marshall Plan and West Germany began its economic recovery. There was already a foundation of quiet respect between the two nations. Historians later argued that part of this goodwill came not from politics, but from human,